Welcome to Should Have Known It, where we present 15-minute videos of things you definitely should have known. Hi, welcome to Shoulda Known It. I'm Miss Aoki, and today's topic is yes and improv rules for real conversations. Most conversational friction doesn't come from people being mean or stupid. It comes from what improvisers call blocking, the unconscious habit of shutting down what someone else just put into the room. A block doesn't have to sound aggressive. Well, actually, is a block. I don't think that's right, is a block. Even sure, but, which sounds agreeable, is a block, because the but erases everything before it. Here's what blocking feels like from the inside. You're talking to a colleague about a project idea, and every time you add a thought, they pivot away from it. After 3 or 4 of those pivots, you stop talking. You haven't been yelled at. Nothing dramatic happened. You've just been quietly trained to shut up. That's the cost of blocking. And most people do it constantly without ever noticing. The reason blocking happens is partly neurological. When someone says something we disagree with, or something we didn't expect, a part of the brain that's scanning for social threat fires before the part that processes content. We correct, redirect, or qualify, not because we're rude, but because we're wired to protect our mental models. Improv training doesn't fight this instinct, it gives you a replacement habit fast enough to override it. Yes, and is the foundational rule of improvisational theater. It has 2 parts that both matter equally. Yes means you accept the premise of what the other person just said. You treat it as true, as real, as something we're both now living inside, and means you add something. You contribute. You push the scene forward. You don't just acknowledge, you build. On stage, yes, and create scenes. If I say, "My God, there's a bear in this kitchen," and my scene partner says yes and he seems to have already found the jam, we now have a scene, we have a world, and it's getting richer. But if my partner says, "I don't think bears like jam," that's a block. The scene dies. 2 people are now arguing about bear dietary preferences instead of being anywhere. In real conversation, the structure is identical. Someone says, "What if we push the deadline to Friday?" Yes. And we could use the extra time to loop in the design team. That's a yes and. You've accepted the premise and added a layer. "I don't think we have time for that" is a block. Same information essentially, but one of these conversations goes somewhere useful and the other one circles. Here's the thing that surprises people. Yes and does not mean agreement. You can yes and a premise you think is wrong, or risky, or incomplete. You're not endorsing it, you're agreeing to examine it. Yes, we could push to Friday, and that would mean shipping without the QA pass. Let's figure out whether that trade-off is worth it. That is a yes and. You've added something real. The conversation is moving. Let's make this concrete. Here's a real exchange from a kind of meeting most of us have had. Someone proposes an idea. Let's say it's a rebrand. The old version, "I think we should rebrand." We rebranded 3 years ago, right? But the market has shifted? I don't think it has. 2 minutes in, both people are defending positions instead of thinking together. Nothing is getting examined. The idea is neither accepted nor rejected. It's just stuck. The yes and version of the same moment, "I think we should rebrand." Yes, and if we did, we'd want to be really clear about what's actually changed since last time. What would you say is driving it? Now, something interesting is happening. The proposer has to think harder and give you real reasons. You've accepted the premise of their concern, that something might have changed, and added a requirement. Let's understand what. That's not softness. That's efficiency. The same principle rescues small talk, which is mostly people blocking each other accidentally. "How was your weekend?" Fine, quiet, that's a block. There's nothing to build on. Versus fine, quiet. "I finally started that novel I bought 6 months ago." Yes, and which one? Now there's a scene. Small talk dies not because it's inherently shallow, but because people haven't been trained to add anything. Yes, and is the cure for one-word answers. The second major improv principle is subtler and, honestly, more transformative. The rule is make your partner look good. In a scene, this means you set your partner up, you give them premises that are fun to work with, you accept and build on their moves, you don't steal focus. But what it really means at the level of intention is that you've stopped trying to win the scene and started trying to make the scene good. These are different goals, and they produce different behavior. In conversation, making your partner look good means something specific. It means treating whatever they just said as interesting and publicly crediting them when they're right. The psychologist Adam Grant at Wharton has studied this in organizational settings, and one of his consistent findings is that teams who credit each other's ideas visibly out loud in meetings generate more ideas over time. It's not politeness, it's an incentive structure. People contribute more when they know contribution gets received. Here's the version of this that genuinely surprises people. Making your partner look good is strategically better for you than trying to look good yourself. Research on credit attribution in group settings shows that people who loudly credit others are rated as more competent, more trustworthy, and more leadership worthy by observers, not less. The person who says that was actually Maya's framework, I just applied it, gets more credit in the long run than the person who absorbs Maya's framework silently. Being generous with credit is not self sacrifice, it's a compounding investment. In arguments with people you're close to, make your partner look good sounds like this: finding the strongest version of what they're trying to say and repeating it back before you respond. So, what you're saying is that you felt like I was dismissing your concern, not just disagreeing with it? Is that right? That moves a fight forward faster than almost anything else because most arguments aren't really about the stated subject, they're about someone feeling like their premise got blocked. Third principle: in improv, everything you say is called an offer. Not a statement, not an assertion, an offer. An offer is something you're giving the other person to work with. This framing matters because it changes the speaker's posture. When you're making an offer, you're paying attention to whether it's receivable. You're thinking about the other person. When you're making a statement, you're just transmitting. The practical version: before you send a message or make a point in a meeting, ask yourself whether you're making an offer or firing a salvo. This plan has three problems: is a salvo. I want to think through the timing with you. I see a few places where we might hit friction. Is an offer. Same information, but the offer format signals that you're inviting collaboration, not delivering a verdict. People respond differently to verdicts than to invitations, even when the content is identical. The trickiest place to apply this is in close relationships, because closeness makes us lazy about offers. We assume our partners can read our intentions, so we stop signaling them. You never clean the kitchen is a salvo. When the kitchen's a mess in the morning, I start the day feeling behind. Can we figure out a system? Is an offer. Both are about the same kitchen. One of them starts a fight, the other starts a conversation. Improv training is essentially practice in remembering to make offers even when you don't feel like it. There's a fourth principle that doesn't get talked about enough outside of improv circles: endowment, and specifically the trap of negative endowment. In improv, to endow a character is to assign them a quality. You seem tired, you're clearly hiding something. Positive endowment is useful, it gives your partner something to play. Negative endowment, you always do this, you're being irrational, traps your partner in a label they now have to fight their way out of instead of moving forward. In real arguments, negative endowment sounds like, you're not listening, you're being defensive, you're doing the thing again. The moment you label someone's internal state, especially negatively, you've transferred the argument from the subject matter to the label, and that fight is almost impossible to win cleanly. You cannot prove you're not being defensive. The act of defending yourself against the charge confirms it. Improvisers learn to avoid this trap by staying specific to what just happened instead of what someone is. And this is the quiet heartbreak of a lot of chronic arguments. The real disagreement is maybe 4 sentences deep, but it gets buried under layers of endowment. You always do this versus that didn't work 3 years ago either, versus you never take my concerns seriously. The original question, whatever it was, never gets resolved. Because the conversation shifted from problem solving to character assessment, both people leave the argument without having said the thing they actually needed to say. There's one more layer worth understanding. Improvisers talk about status constantly. Not social class, but the moment to moment negotiation of who's directing the scene. High status moves are confident, deliberate, slow. Low status moves are fast, self interrupting, apologetic, and here's the key insight: neither is inherently better. A great scene needs both. A great conversation does too. The mistake most people make, especially in professional settings, is treating every conversation like a status competition, trying to stay high status throughout. This produces conversations where both people talk past each other at high speed, nobody concedes anything, and the meeting ends with a follow-up email that relitigates the whole thing. Deliberately dropping status, asking a genuine question, saying I hadn't thought of it that way, is not weakness, it's scene work. You're giving the other person something to build on. The most skilled improvisers, and not coincidentally, the most effective conversationalists, use status shifts strategically. They're not consistent in any one register, they move. They go high to establish a point clearly, low to invite input, high again to synthesize. If you watch someone who's genuinely good at running meetings or at difficult conversations, this is often exactly what you're watching. A person who knows when to give the floor away and when to take it back, and who treats both moves as equally sophisticated. Everything we've covered, yes. And making your partner look good, offers, avoiding endowment, managing status, all of it rests on one foundational skill that improv training hammers into performers from day one: actually listening, not waiting to talk, not composing your response while the other person is still speaking, listening as if what they say might genuinely change what you were about to say. Because in a good conversation, it should. Cognitive load research by psychologists like Graham Bodie shows that most people are running their response in working memory while someone else is talking, which means they're only capturing about 60% of what's being said. Improv games solve this by making you repeat back what your partner said before adding your own line, a constraint that forces the listening habit. You can do this in real life without the explicit rule. It just takes the intention. Before I respond, let me make sure I have this right, is a sentence that has ended more arguments than any rebuttal I know. What's remarkable is that the techniques we've covered today were developed entirely to make comedy better, to make scenes funnier, more alive, more surprising on stage, and yet they're essentially a complete theory of how not to waste a conversation. Viola Spolin didn't know she was writing a relationship manual. Del Close, who codified most of what became modern improv at the IO Theater in Chicago, probably didn't think of himself as a conflict resolution specialist, but they accidentally solved something that therapists, negotiators, and management consultants are still charging a lot of money to address. If you take only one thing from today, I'd make it this. For the next week, catch yourself using the word but in conversation. Not eliminate it, just notice it. I hear you, but that's a good point. But every time you hear yourself say it, ask whether what you're about to say requires erasing what came before it, or whether you could connect to it instead. Could but become and? Could the disagreement be added to the conversation rather than substituted for what was just said? Most of the time, you'll find you can. That's a good point. And I also want to flag the timeline issue is strictly more honest than, that's a good point, but the timeline is a problem. Because the timeline really is a problem, and the point really was good. The but made you choose between them. The and lets you hold both. That's the whole game, really. Conversations are scenes. And scenes get better when people stop trying to win them and start trying to make them. These principles work because they're generous. Not in a naive way, you're not rolling over, you're not agreeing with everything. You're not being soft, you're being collaborative, which is different. You're treating the conversation as something worth building rather than something to survive. That shift in intention from surviving to building is what Spolin was after, and it's available to anyone willing to practice it, even off the stage, especially off the stage. That's our time for today. Go make some offers. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me and learning something new. Until next time, click like and subscribe.